Welcome and good morning, everybody. And welcome to everybody who's joined us online today. Thank you very much. So nice to be connected to you. I know everyone here at ISV is feeling happy today because last night we had a very wonderful Harinam performance in Palo Alto. And there's always feeling satisfaction the next day after performing yoga, don't you think? Yes. It was quite an incredible presentation with a lot of thought went into it, and the results are there. People are coming into a festival and just seeing how these ways in which planning to greet people so that they can come into the joyful atmosphere of Krishna consciousness is a good way to spend one's time. And the result is amazing because as I was watching some of the people last night receive books, they were already interested in the Harinam and very fascinated. And then they were able to, that second row can move up too. Unfortunately, when you move one row, everything's got to move because but when I saw that people who were watching were getting books in their hands, I was feeling great satisfaction because I knew they had something substantial to take home with them. There's not much that's very substantial about the material world. It's something that is endlessly perplexing and disappointing. As we expect that it'll be stable and there's a way in which I may develop optimism in the material world in my stake here. In fact, there's lots of information that one can receive to develop one's faith in developing one's position here in the material world. But eventually those things fall apart very suddenly sometimes, and having information about a solid reality, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, you should analyze these things. Nasato vidite bhavo, napavo vidite sata, ubayor apidrishtontas tanios tatvadarshibhi. Those who are seers of the truth have analyzed very carefully the difference between the material body and our actual self, and have concluded that one is not real in the sense that it's temporary, and the other is very real. And there's a lot everything to be optimistic about on the spiritual side. On the material side, it's okay to let go of your optimism because there's nothing really here for you, nothing to see. Keep moving on. And in the prayers of Gajendra, I was reading the 8th canto while traveling in Japan, and I came across a purport that really moved me. We were traveling by van. I read it out loud to the devotees who were traveling with. They liked it also. It is a subtle point, but Prabhupada, Gajendra says that the material world's a difficult place to figure out. Sometimes we can't tell if we're coming or going. We don't know where we came from. Should we work hard here and build our stake in the material world, or should we completely renounce it? It's really hard to tell exactly what to do here. But Gajendra said, based on the analysis of the great saints, one should not become attached to the material world. One should not have faith in the material world, and one should give it up. And in his purport, Prabhupada mentions how the material world's a complicated place, seemingly, but on the advice of the great souls, we should simply not put our faith in the material world at all. We can take it from them. That is similar that Krishna is saying, although he's the supreme authority, saying these seers of the truth have said this about the material world, and that we should take it from them. So seeing people get actual solid information about the difference between matter and spirit, as we did last night, a lot of people with Bhagavad Gitas in their hands and other books. And watching the faces of people, I say this practically every time after, but I really enjoy seeing the faces of people who are absorbed in listening to the holy names and appreciating it. There's a kind of ponderous look that people have on their faces. They're trying to figure out why they're so attracted to it. At least that's my interpretation of the way they look. They're trying to figure out, why am I so attracted to this? Why is this so nice? It's not something that's intellectually available right away to say, oh, this is why. It's just a natural feeling. The holy name is attractive. There's an opulence to it. And when we build a frame for it, where we build an arena where it's obviously something very special, as we're crafting this kind of frame. So when we chant the holy name, this is our church. This is the real church in Kali Yuga, to go out and present the holy name so people can hear it. And when we create an area where it looks like we're taking it very seriously, and we have the sitting places, and we have information available through what looks like normal channels, booths with racks and things like that, and there's lighting, then it opens people's channels. They can drink in the holy name a little more deeply than if it was done haphazardly, or we just did it as an afterthought. So the more that we invest our intelligence in how to present the holy names and these literatures, which are kirtan but written down, that's all it is. It's the same vibration, but it's just written down and put in a container that people can take with them. Then such a preoccupation is a good way to use one's life energy and human intelligence. It gets used in so many other ways, inventing things that bring people to buy something else. I mean, there's a lot of energy that goes into these big corporations. And at the end, what actually comes out is something that is not necessarily very satisfying. They're basically tools so people can go more deeply into the internet. And what do they find there? I mean, a lot of things that aren't very satisfactory to the soul. Isn't that true, or is it just me? Yeah. Okay, just checking up. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Ballabha Girivardhari Gopi Jana Ballabha Girivardhari Yashoda Nandana Vraja Jana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Vraja Jana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Vraja Jana Ranjana Jashodanandana Vrajajanaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Jamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Vrajajanaranjana Yashodanandana Vrajajanaranjana Yashodanandana Vrajajanaranjana Yashodanandana Vrajajanaranjana Junatira Vanachari Jamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Sarasatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudiraye. In the Bhagavad Gita, please. So, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna gives many instructions, but one of them that I've been thinking about regularly because I've been studying the third chapter, Karma Yoga, and the last several verses in the third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita are very encouraging because they're practical. And the last verse in the third chapter says, Evam buddhi param buddva samstabhya paramatmana jahi shatrum mahabaho kamarupa durasadam. In essence, he's saying that you can realize by intelligence, spiritual intelligence, directed toward yourself, your spiritual self, your Atma, that you are higher than matter. And thus you can conquer the lower self by the higher self. And there is an ongoing conundrum here in the material world between the lower self and the higher self that Arjuna mentions earlier in the Bhagavad Gita when he says that one seems to be overcome at certain points by a force. He asked Krishna, what is that force that causes me to deviate from following your instructions? Because Krishna said he has given very clear instructions about what to do, and he says, Ye me matam idam nityam anutishtanti maharva. That follow my instructions and everything will be fine. And then he says in the next verse, if you don't follow my instructions, then everything won't be fine. Then Arjuna wants to know later on, what is it that dissuades me from following your instructions and doing everything that I should do? And then Krishna says, it's this force of nature that is born of contact with rajas, with the passion mode, and kama, lust. And it's this eternal enemy of the soul. And then he describes it in strategic terms that lust energy can occupy the senses, the mind, can also get into the intelligence. And then he tells Arjuna that you can deliberate and see that you're actually above all these various entities that he's named, the senses, the mind, the intelligence. So he says in this verse, Evam Bude Param Budva Samstabhyamanam Atmana Jahi Shatrum Mahabahu Kama Rupam Durasadam. Now we'll look at the word for word and you'll become unlimitedly encouraged. Are you ready for that? That's why you're here, right? Evam, thus, Buddhe, to intelligence, Param, superior, Budva, knowing, Samstabhya, by steadying, Atmanam, the mind, Atmana, by deliberate intelligence, Jahi, conquer, Shatrum, the enemy, Mahabaho, O mighty armed one, Kama Rupam, in the form of lust, Durasadam, formidable. Translation. Thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Let's say it together. Thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So first of all, there is such a thing as spiritual strength, and that's something that we should work towards. And there's elaborate descriptions of that spiritual strength that come through the Goswami literatures. For instance, in the Nectar of Devotion, it's explained that there are various stages of our devotional practice. And one of them is actually defined by this spiritual strength. In the stage of Nishta, when one becomes firmly situated, one can stand on one's own 2 feet and not be pushed around by the senses, the mind, by lust. Then one's known to have this spiritual strength, and it can be increased more and more, the spiritual strength. And also, this verse shows us that we can know ourselves as transcendental to the material mind and the material senses, mind, and intelligence. You can actually know it for yourself. You can see it for yourself, because the soul is self-luminous and can know itself. You can see the self by the self. And these other entities, are lower entities, are instruments. But we can actually observe that we're higher than the intelligence the mind and the senses. And also, very important, it says, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence. Deliberate spiritual intelligence. And in previous classes, we've talked about this word deliberate, right? To become deliberate, you have to deliberate. You have to think about what is my situation and look very carefully. So let's read the purport. This third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead without considering impersonal voidness the ultimate end. In material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by properties for lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for overlording and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and the intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind. By steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. See, it's hyphenate. There's this hyphen, and then he says, by spiritual intelligence directed toward one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man toward spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. So, this higher intelligence very specifically comes from the scriptures. That's why it's vital that every day the devotees here at ISV have to read. You have to read. You have to read the Bhagavatam, you have to read Prabhupada's purports, you have to read the Nectar Devotion. If you don't read these things, then the intelligence doesn't get trained. If you don't read Bhagavad Gita, your intelligence will be influenced in other ways. And when your intelligence is influenced by even very sophisticated philosophical ideas, but they're not based in pure Krishna consciousness, then you won't be able to tread the path of pure devotional service, and you won't be satisfied. But if you read every day and you hear from Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Nectar Devotion, you have a steady diet, which means you have to measure it every day. Anybody who's ever been on a diet knows that you can't do it whimsically. You have to actually measure it and say, okay, this is 2 ounces, this is not 2 ounces, right? And similarly, when we practice Krishna consciousness, we have to be very careful to complete our prescribed number of rounds, and our prescribed amount of reading has to be done every day. And by doing that, one can actually develop this higher intelligence, because the higher intelligence is coming to us through the scripture and also from Krishna within our heart. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pritipurvakam dadami buddhi yogam tam yena mamupayanti te. Krishna says, if you're very sincere and you're developing your intention for advancing in spiritual life, you're specifically pointing your desire and praying, please, I'm very fallen, but I would like to be elevated, then Krishna will help. So these 2 things, we should hone our intention, make our intention strong, and we should also take action by hearing from Scripture every day, because that's where transcendent ideas come from. As we were approaching the Harinam party yesterday, I was talking to Radhakripa Prabhu, and we were walking up the street, and I was just remarking about how people need a helping hand that comes from a higher platform. That means the avatar comes from a higher position and extends himself to the lower position to help us out. And that's the holy name, and that's the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam. They're avatars. They've appeared in this world from a higher plane of existence. And We have to take advantage, however. Just because you have Bhagavad Gita in your house doesn't mean that you're going to become advanced. Just because you're part of a spiritual institution that has extremely authorized connections to Krishna doesn't mean that you're going to advance. You have to actually read the scriptures and you have to chant the mantras. You have to chant your mantras. If you don't chant your mantras, what do you expect? You can just expect to be swept away by Maya, that's all. You have to get your mantras every day. It's food, it's nourishment, it's the only way we can actually remain steady in this material world. You have to get your mantras. You actually have to say the whole mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And even when you don't feel like it, you have to say the mantra. You have to repeat the mantra. It has its effect, but you have to do it. And if you don't do it, then it's just like when you're on a diet and you cheat. I'm on a diet. It's like, you don't look like you're on a diet. Guy said something, it's like, kept telling me he's on a diet, and I was thinking, like, I don't think so, And because you're only fooling yourself. So you have to take the mantras serious, and you have to take seriously, and you have to take the scriptures very seriously. And if you do that every day, very carefully, you complete every word, every period, finish it, hear it, let it go in. Then you can develop this. This is what the meaning here. This is the practical application. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. Higher intelligence is in here. Comes from the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, at the end of the Gita, 18th chapter, near the end of the 18th chapter, Krishna says that anyone who studies this dialogue between myself and Arjuna worships me by his intelligence. You have to do that worship every day. Then intellect has to get involved. Otherwise, it'll go somewhere else. And there are myriad possibilities to engage the intellect these days. And it'll be stimulated in a way that is not satisfying and doesn't help us advance in Krishna consciousness. Earlier in the purport, it says that one must direct one's intelligence. Just go back up a little bit. That hyphenation, by steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. And this is something that requires introspection. How's the temperature in here? It's too warm. Bring it down 2 degrees. And give Mayapur a coat, because he's got a funny look on his face. Jacket for Mayapur, and everyone else turn it down 2 degrees. Okay, so what does this mean? By steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. We have a pure identity. What is the pure identity? It's that I'm a servant of Krishna, and that I'm not my body, I'm a spiritual soul. And the moment I direct my intelligence towards that identity, I feel satisfied. Jiv Krishna Das e Bishwas, Korletor Adukona. If you have this Vishwas, you have this faith that I'm the servant of Krishna, then Duk, your disalignment with the material world that's caused by misidentifying myself as my body will be eradicated. Bhayam dvitiya abhinibeshita syad ishad apetasya viparyo smriti. Kavi Yogendra says that all we get in this state of consciousness where I'm identifying with the body is fear of loss. And there are practical ways that we can consider how I'm not my body, because after all, you can observe the body and see that I'm not it. And you can observe other people's bodies and see they're not it either. People get attracted to a beautiful woman. Why? Because she has nice hair. But if one piece of hair gets in your soup, you'll never eat that soup again, and you'll want your money back if you go to a restaurant and they give you hair. It's the most beautiful woman in the world cooking, and then One hair gets in the soup. I say, I want my money back. And by the way, I'll never eat that kind of soup ever again in my life. So there's a disconnect between what is reality and what is actually what I'm perceiving in this material world. And we have to get in touch with that. We actually have to see that I'm not my body and other people aren't their bodies either. And by that deliberate intelligence, that's what's being talked about here. Observe carefully, see what's the difference between the body and the self, and turn one's attention towards one's pure identity. And that can be done practically also through service. And say, I am the servant of Krishna. Realize I'm serving somebody. You have to serve somebody. And if I rearrange my life so that I can serve Krishna, then I'm actually acting in my constitutional position, and I'll feel for myself that I'm aligned properly, and I'll feel the satisfaction of that. And that nothing is as encouraging as progress. And also, Jiva Goswami says, ultimately, the only evidence that is acceptable is one's personal experience. You have to see it for yourself. It can't be intellectualized, philosophized. You actually have to feel that now I'm back in the right groove. And once you have that, then you'll notice that those who have apparently everything going for them in the material world, like the Goswamis of Vrindavan, Rupa and Sanatana Goswami, were properly situated in material life. They had what everybody wants, which is wealth and influence and fame. And when they got properly aligned with Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the Srimad Bhagavatam, they had no difficulty whatsoever in transitioning from service to all this wealth to service to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And we can see that that is a practical thing that we can have in our lives also. And there's a service spot waiting for us. We just have to take advantage of it. We have to claim that service by moving towards it practically and engaging in it. And Krishna will have it expand in our life. So this is a verse that we can take shelter of again and again. Very practical. That through this intelligence, natural intelligence that we'll gain from the scripture, and through introspection, we can observe for ourselves that we're higher. I just think sometimes parents tell their kids, you're better than this. You're better than that when the kid does something wrong. You know, you're better than that. And Krishna's saying to us here in the material world, you know, you're better than this. You don't have to do this, by the way. You don't have to subject yourself to the embarrassment of the world, of the material world, all the embarrassments of misidentifying oneself with the body. You're better than that, you know? And in this verse, it's saying, pull yourself up. In very strong terms. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho, like a warrior, stand up and fight and observe for yourself. So let's visit the Bhagavatam so that we're fortified. Gajendra in his prayers of surrender. I was reading on where I was traveling on my iPad. So now I have to orient myself to the written page, which I like better, but I couldn't carry all my books with me traveling. I just want to read you one verse in purport. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Gajendra is 8:3:10, and he says, Nama Atma Pradipaya, Sakshine Paramatmane, Namo Giram Viduraya, Manasash Chetasam Api. I offer my respectful obeisances unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the self-effulgent Supersoul, who is the witness in everyone's heart, who enlightens the individual soul and who cannot be reached by exercises of the mind, word, or consciousness. Prabhupada writes, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, cannot be understood by the individual soul through mental, physical, or intellectual exercises. It is by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead that the individual soul is enlightened. Therefore, the Lord is described here as Atma Pradipa. Atma Pradipa. The Lord is like the sun, which illuminates everything and cannot be illuminated by anyone. Therefore, if one is serious about understanding the Supreme, one must receive enlightenment from Him, as instructed in Bhagavad Gita. One cannot understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead by one's mental, physical, or intellectual powers. And it's mentioned here that He's a witness, and there's a way in which He's simply observing all the activities that I'm undergoing, and even the thoughts and desires that I harbor, that I maintain. And in a very neutral way, He's facilitating whatever I want. So being aware of the fact that Krishna is the witness is a very direct path to self-realization, because He's there within the heart, and He is my well-wisher, and He is also my protector, and He's the one who's supplying everything. Nityo nityanam chaitanas chaitananam eko bahunam yo viditati kaman. He's the one who's supplying everything. So becoming aware of the fact that there's an omniscient, omnipotent witness to all my activities definitely changes the way in which I conduct myself, or even the way I maintain my internal existence. That is, I may act one way externally, and internally I may act another way. But becoming aware of the fact that there's a witness to all my thoughts, desires, and activities, I may also try to reform the way I desire and the way I think, because it's a form of respectful worship to keep one's heart clean and focused on devotional service rather than giving into material desires. Yes?
Thank you, Maharaj. I have a question. I've been wondering since last night, after the Harinam experience, and I'm connecting to what Bhaktivinoda Thakur has written in Jaiva Dharma, that sensory experience is very important in the material world for people to come closer to Krishna consciousness. I mean, just like yesterday night also, because there is sensory experiences there in terms of kirtan or prasad, or the relationships which they were observing there. So it appears from that still there is some weightage to sensory experience. So I just wanted to ask this question, how does that fit in here, where Srila Prabhupada says that we cannot understand Supreme Personality of Godhead through mental, physical, or intellect level, or is that sensory experience just like a stage and above that, mercy will help? Because we have felt...
Well, there's a question that comes up by the prayers personified Vedas, that how is it that with material senses and mind and material sound vibration, apparently, one can become enlightened? And the answer is that the Supreme Controller, who's the source of all energies, can transform the various energies. And when one comes in contact, when one uses one's senses properly and connects them to spiritual activity, then the senses become revealed, the actual original senses. And that's borne out in the verse, Sarvapati vanirmuktam tat pratvena nirmalam rishikena rishikesha sevanam bhaktiruchite, that there's a Supreme Controller, the master of the senses, the Lord of the senses. And when the senses are used externally, but they're used to connect to the holy name and to the, all the festivities that we arranged last night for people, some kind of sensory input, then because the input, the stimuli are transcendental, and then the senses become also purified by that experience. So Narada Muni says in the 5th chapter of the 1st canto of the Bhagavatam that you have to take a thorn out with a thorn. And there's a way in which we use all our senses and our mind and everything like that, but because normally it's the cause of entanglement, when it's used for transcendental purpose, it becomes the source of liberation. Om Tat Sat. And now I very much appreciate, thank you very much all of you who set up these books. It's been a team effort to produce this book called Our Family Business, and this today, to this moment, is the very moment that this book is being launched here in the United States. We did it in India because we printed the book in New Delhi, and you can't tell because the printer, Brahma Muhurta Prabhu, who lives in Sweden, BBT, head of the BBT there, is so expert that he arranged with a very expert printer in India. Not only that, in the contract, he has stipulated what particular machinery, what ink, what paper, everything like that. So it doesn't feel or look like a book printed outside of Germany or America or something like that, because sometimes you can tell the difference. And we had it printed there because we were on a timeline and we had to have it available by the ISKCON Leadership Sangha, during which thousands of ISKCON leaders come from around the world. And we had been pushing for that deadline for a while. You have to have some deadline, otherwise, at least I do. Otherwise, I would still be writing. And we chose that deadline as a good time to launch the book. And that required that we had to have it finished. It had to be finished by the beginning of August. Of course, we dragged on a little while. And there are, in writing a book, so many things to consider that I never thought of before because I never wrote a book. But there are many, many aspects to producing a book because it's actually a physical object. You have to put it together, and it takes a team to put it together. And we printed it in Delhi because it wouldn't have made it in time if we printed it anywhere else. So from Delhi it was shipped to Mayapur, and it arrived a little bit early, which was a surprise. And we got the information one night that it was on a truck in Shantipur, passing through Shantipur. We go, I'm in Shantipur. It's like, where? You mean Advaitacharya's house? And yes, and it'll be there in a few hours. So they came, and then Navina Nirada was very instrumental in helping in so many ways. But he put the books in storage in the Vaishnava Academy, and then we set up a booth. Shraddha and Mukaravinda used up all their sick time and extra time, everything they put together, they put it together in a bundle and took it to their companies and said, we got something else we got to do. And they used all that up, all their time, so that they could be there and help with this, which was essential because they were there around the clock, making this book available to the devotees there. So we had printed for India, for the ILS, that's ISKCON Leadership Sangha, 1,500 copies, and they sold out. They sold out at the ILS. We only had a few copies to bring home ourselves, and that was a great success at the ILS. And then the other books were supposed to arrive in America around, when were they supposed to be here? And Gaur Purnima, there's supposed to be a Gaur Purnima there, but then we got the information that one of the docks where the books were being shipped from had a riot. And I don't know all the information, but something went wrong with the labor force there, and they weren't able to ship, so they didn't arrive until just a few days ago in Los Angeles. And the team working on this had them expedite the shipping up here, so they just got here yesterday, I think, to ISV. So the book was a labor of love. It was something that I had been asked to do by many senior devotees, and they wanted me to write about the importance of book distribution. So what I'm going to do is, instead of talking about it, I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and I think I'll start with well, here's a book here. Actually, there's one in my bag that's already open, so. And I think in this, I tried to explain. There's a foreword, by the way, by Vaisesiksa Prabhu. Does anybody know who he is? Raise your hand if you've heard of him. He's a scholar and also a very deep devotee. He came here and spoke for a little while. There's a whole history behind why I asked him, besides the fact that I think he's one of the best writers in ISKCON. But I developed a personal relationship with him. Well, I've known him since the early 70s, but then more recently we became close. And maybe I'll talk about that later. But his foreword was very important for me. Well, I will talk about it, because that's the first thing in the book, the foreword. You need somebody to write a foreword that has some stature. He has some spiritual stature, great spiritual stature, for many of the reasons I just mentioned. But also, there was a perception. He was a GBC temple president for many years, and some people thought that he was not a book distributor, or he wasn't interested in book distribution, or he might be even averse to it. And when I started going to Philadelphia, where he was the temple president a few years ago, and working with the devotees there to develop a team of book distributors, or to enhance the team, he was the GBC temple president, and therefore any of the enhancements that we needed to make had to go through him. And in the process of working with him and the team, I got to know him. So at one particular time, we were sitting in a board meeting. That is, the members of the Philadelphia Temple Board were there, and Vaisesiksa Prabhu was there. And we had about 8 requisitions we needed to ask for. Some of them were not small. We wanted our own space for a book room. The book room was sort of unceremoniously placed in the boiler room or something like that. And we wanted to clear out one of the other rooms that was being used for other things and have it exclusive for a book room, which was a big thing in any temple space. It's something that devotees fight over, as we know. And there were other things on the list that were important. So as the Sankirtan leader was going down the list, and I was sitting next to Vaisesiksa Prabhu in this meeting with about 10 devotees in attendance, he kept saying, granted, granted, granted. Everything that came up, granted. About 3/4 of the way through the list, I said, wow, you're really behind this. And he goes, I was there. I was with Prabhupada. I saw how much he was into this book distribution. And it was a little bit of a reaction because he had been sort of painted as somebody who was not into book distribution. But he said, I just wanted the methodology to be very sound, for us to think about it in long-term ways and things like that. And he felt that that hadn't been considered as much as it could have. But his heart was really into it. So when I asked him to write the foreword, I wasn't exactly sure what he would write, how much. So it was a little bit of a gamble, because I thought maybe he would color it with something, the past was in our book distribution wasn't so savory or something like that, but none of that. His endorsement of this book, of the project, and of book distribution in general was so powerful that we were overjoyed when we received it, besides the fact that it's so brilliantly written, as is everything that he writes. So the foreword is there by Vaisesiksa Prabhu. Not only that, this is a side benefit, but when I asked him to write the foreword and he readily agreed, he also said, well, I'll have to read the book before I write the foreword. And of course, at that time, I just had a working manuscript, or it was in process. So I gave him everything that we had in the manuscript, and he began to read through it, and he said, do you mind if I make a few editorial comments? And I said, of course not. And his comments were nothing less than brilliant. I mean, he's such a wordsmith and philosophically so powerful that he substantially contributed to the book in that way by coming up with various ideas for little changes here and there that made a big difference. And so that was a great boon in the process of writing this book. I also have to mention my chief editor, Keshavabharti Das Goswami, who's my best friend for so many years. I met him when I first joined the temple in San Francisco. He was a grihasta at the time. He and his wife lived together with Jayananda, the famous Jayananda, and his wife. And it's at their house that Prabhupada used to stay when he would come and visit us in San Francisco. They'd move out and fix up the house, paint it and everything like that, and then Prabhupada would move in for a few days. And we've been together in Krishna consciousness through all these years. And he also developed as an editor, because he's a very educated and intelligent person to start with, and then he took on many projects editing various books for the BBT, particularly the Brihat Bhagavatamrita, which is an epic literature, and took years of editing work with a team. Gopi Pranadhana Prabhu, Jayadvaita Swami, Keshavabharti Maharaj, worked on it tirelessly for years. And then he helped Shivaram Maharaj produce his books. I think all in all, he's edited about 11 books or so. So a very experienced person. And I credit him with forcing me to write this book, because I wrote it so many times in my mind, and I thought, well, it's done. And people ask me, how's your book going? I said, it's almost done. How much you've written? Well, not much, but I know what I'm going to write. But there's a big difference between thinking a book and writing a book. When you're actually confronted with a blank page and you have to put words on it, and then there's a critic that lives on the shoulder that says, that's no good. No one's going to like that. And there are a lot of forces. And I did, in the beginning, when I first started reading this book, I found very creative ways to procrastinate. Shall I tell you some of them? One of my most creative ways was to walk to the library in Burlingame and check out books about how not to procrastinate about writing. And one of them was by an Australian writer who said, here's how you do it. You get some glue and put it in your seat. And you just don't get up. And another one which was called The War of Art. You've heard of the art of war. This is called The War of Art. And that in the creative process is very difficult, because you're confronting what he calls resistance, and he uses a capital R. And this resistance is so strong, he said, did you know that Adolf Hitler was an artist? But to resist the creative process, he went off and started wars and everything like that. So there's a lot to be said about procrastination. And one of the other ways that I procrastinated was I started learning Sanskrit. I actually had a teacher on Skype, and I was taking Sanskrit class until I got busted one day. when Keshavarti Maharaj walked in early in the morning, and he saw me talking to some guy, a Sanskrit expert in South America, and I had all these papers on my desk, all the things I was learning. And he looked at me, looked at the guy, and he just walked out with the disgust. And he came in later. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm learning Sanskrit." And he said, "You're supposed to be writing," which was his mantra for many, many months, until he finally convinced me that, you just can't do this unless you drop everything else and concentrate on one thing. It was very difficult for me to do because I have a lot of projects going on at the same time. So I worked with a small team of devotees headed by Shraddha Devi Dasi to help delegate everything that I was doing. And that was a great help in my life, actually, to get reorganized and actually take inventory of all the things I had to do. And then I really did take some time, some months, where all I did was write. And I put everything else out of my mind. And there were alarms going off all the time. You probably know about them, alarms that go off and say, unless you write this person back, they're going to hate you for the rest of your life, right? And I just had to let those things go. And some people do hate me, kind of figured, you don't love me and this and that. But there's absolutely nothing I could do. I had to stop, and I had to just concentrate on writing. And I also found that writing is a lot like cooking. You can't rush cooking. You can't say, I want this to go faster. When you're baking bread, you have to let it rise. And so in the creative process of writing, I found that when I was working on a chapter, on a concept, I really did have to give it full attention. And then I had to write it and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it. I read a famous writer had said, writing means rewriting. And that's very true, at least it was for me. Each draft I had to do a minimum of 5 times. Minimum of 5 times. Then give it to the editors and then rewrite it after I got back from the editors when they said this, and so forth. A lot of the time I went over everything I wrote with directly with Keshavarti Maharaj. Most of the time he was somewhere else, but practically we're in the same room by Skype all the time, reading the things. And then Kaishori Devi Dasi was an expert editor for the BBT and has worked on many books, including Radhanath Swami's books and others. Was very helpful in the overall structure of the book, was able to see from a higher level objectively how to put it together. So she was an unlimited help. And my wife, Nirakula Devi Dasi, was so understanding and helped to, at any time, just create a barrier around me so that I could just write. And I must say that it was her cooking that kept me inspired. It is so important. I can't believe how many calories you burn thinking, actually thinking. And it's very rare that I ever do think. I can see that. And she answered a lot of my emails, yes. There was an autoresponder on my email saying, don't talk to me, talk to my wife, because I'm not available anymore. And so it was a space I had to enter into to do this creative process. And in the process, I felt some divine intervention. I felt that the devotees that came forward to help. Another one was Jayadvaita Swami, who is part of the BBT, part of the boon of writing for the book. The book belongs to the BBT. I donated it to them. I gave it. It's not my book. It belongs to the BBT. And in the process, because the book has a lot to do with the BBT, all the BBT trustees wanted to read it. So, double-edged sword. On one side, we were thinking, well, they're going to tear it to shreds, and it takes so long for everybody to read it. But on the other hand, we had a lot of positive input, not the least of which was from Jayadvaita Swami, who is arguably the best editor in ISKCON. He wrote his own book recently and just won a Benjamin Franklin Award, Gold Award for religious books. It's a prestigious award, very powerful, for his book on Ecclesiastes called Vanity Karma. So he read the book, gave his comments, others gave their comments. So it went through a lot of hands, which is unusual. When you write a book, sometimes you don't get that much help. But I got a lot of help and input from sources I didn't believe. So it led me to understand that this was something that Krishna wanted to come out, and he was adding putting some wind in the sails of this project. So in the preface, which I'll read now, if I may. Dear reader, even though you've just picked up this book and it's possible that we're meeting for the first time, I want to reveal my heart to you about why I wrote this book before you go any further. Srila Prabhupada's books rescued me from the material world. I never wanted to be a normal high school kid. I wanted to know more about life and truth than the mundane subjects they teach you. I wanted to know what death is and why I have to die. As educated and well-meaning as my teachers and parents were, however, they couldn't answer such questions. I was 16 when I set out on my spiritual quest. I gave away most of my possessions and stopped wearing shoes and riding in cars. I fasted, prayed, and meditated. In my quest for answers to life's troubling mysteries, I read any book that looked spiritual. Because I was able to formulate questions, I believed there must be answers to them, so I kept looking. My persistence paid off the day I received one of Srila Prabhupada's Back to Godhead magazines. As I read and reread it, I found myself touched to the core by Srila Prabhupada's clear, confident, authoritative voice. Reading him was different from reading anyone else. He answered the questions that were haunting me. But he also answered questions I hadn't known to ask. I took complete shelter of Srila Prabhupada's books. I took complete shelter of Srila Prabhupada and his books in the summer of 1973. Studying and distributing them have been my life's mission ever since. And in this book, I share some of the things I've learned over 4 decades of performing this service for Srila Prabhupada's pleasure. I called this book Our Family Business because Krishna's devotees are a family, and it has always been the business of that family to share Krishna's glories with as many people as possible. Srila Prabhupada, as a good son of his spiritual master, considered every sincere member of his spiritual family and every service rendered as important and equally valuable. Still, anyone who served directly under Srila Prabhupada, or anyone who has made a careful study of his writings, can't help but notice that Srila Prabhupada was especially pleased when his devotees went out to teach Krishna consciousness to others, especially by distributing his books. On October 27, 1976, for example, Srila Prabhupada wrote to Jayatirtha Das, Krishna becomes more and more pleased by seeing the increment of book distribution. Devotional service is absolute, but one who preaches his message becomes very dear to Lord Krishna. Unquote. May this book remind us of Srila Prabhupada's penchant for printing and distributing his books. May it instill in future generations of workers in Srila Prabhupada's family business, no matter what service they may perform, that distributing his books has a special place in Srila Prabhupada's heart and in the hearts of our previous acharyas, and that pleasing the Guru is the active principle that allows advancement in Krishna consciousness. In these pages, I have mostly written about the history of book distribution from Srila Prabhupada's arrival in the U.S. in 1965 until his departure from this world in 1977. For these histories clearly show the direct correlation between the rapid growth of book distribution and the astounding expansion of the Hare Krishna movement. Srila Prabhupada confirmed this correlation in an arrival address given in Los Angeles on June 20th, 1975. Quote, print as many books in as many languages and distribute throughout the whole world. Then the Krishna consciousness movement will automatically increase. But although I mainly stayed within those years when discussing the history of book distribution, I don't want to give the impression that the story ends there or that those years are all that matter. So I have set up a wiki page, ourfamilybusiness.info, where devotees can continue telling this very important story. Please visit, tell us of your own history and realizations and of all the accomplishments you or others have had regarding book distribution that don't appear in the pages of this book. People often suggest that despite ISKCON's earlier successes in expanding book distribution, many things could have been done better. I agree. Aspiring to improve one's service is an eternal principle. Success in the service of distributing Srila Prabhupada's books depends particularly on the quality of one's consciousness. Book distribution is a special service in that Krishna arranges for devotees to meet a wide variety of souls in order to plant the seed of bhakti in their hearts. During that intense endeavor, distributors are tested in unique ways, and they may make the mistake of putting off the very persons they are trying to benefit. While representing the Supreme, for example, devotees can easily develop a condescending attitude and, losing track of their own compassion and humility, mistreat or disrespect the people they are approaching. Disrespecting others is not only forbidden in Scripture, it is counterproductive in the spreading of Krishna consciousness. The world doesn't need a new group of fanatics. Rather, it needs compassionate, well-adjusted devotees who genuinely care about each person they meet. It is not only vital that people receive Srila Prabhupada's books, but that we also deliver those books in ways that endear us to their recipients. What's more, those entrusted with management positions in the Sankirtan movement must always remember that it is their sacred duty to care for the devotees in their charge. Unfortunately, we didn't always have that understanding in the past. Managers who put money and bricks before the spiritual advancement and practical necessities of the devotees under their care do more harm than good. Managers must remember that purity is the force. Learning to distribute Srila Prabhupada's books on their own merit and thus allowing the distributors to feel the joy and spiritual depth that comes from sharing Krishna consciousness with others is very different from engaging devotees in selling stickers, candles, paintings, and who knows what else. Many of the anomalies some of us now attribute to book distribution were actually caused by ill-advised diversions into selling anything but books in the name of Sankirtan. In his purport to Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Lila 791, Srila Prabhupada states that the real goal of our mission is not to simply collect money. Rather, we want to see that the devotees in our movement and people in general advance in Krishna consciousness. Quote, according to the revealed scriptures, if a spiritual master can convert even one soul into a perfectly pure devotee, his mission in life is fulfilled. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur always used to say, even at the expense of all the properties, temples, and mutts that I have, if I could convert even one person into a pure devotee, my mission would be fulfilled. It is very difficult, however, to understand the science of Krishna, what to speak of developing love of Godhead. Therefore, if by the grace of Lord Chaitanya and the spiritual master, a disciple attains the standard of pure devotional service, the spiritual master is very happy. The spiritual master is not actually happy if the disciple brings him money. But when he sees that a disciple is following the regulative principles and advancing in spiritual life, he is very glad and feels obliged to such an advanced disciple. Unquote. To neglect the spiritual, emotional, and physical needs of the devotees who are pushing on Lord Chaitanya's mission is immoral. Mature or enlightened leaders understand that devotees who come to the Krishna consciousness movement are not only special souls, but volunteers. Such surrendered souls must be protected and encouraged, never exploited or coerced. In our family business, I emphasize empowerment over bureaucracy and encouragement over coercion. In ISKCON's early days, devotees were sometimes sent out on book distribution without proper training, encouragement, or consideration of their physical or mental capabilities. Discouraged and in some cases traumatized, some still cringe whenever book distribution is discussed. I feel their pain. I hope the recent developments in the great art of distributing Srila Prabhupada's books presented in our family business help those devotees heal from their earlier experiences. May our past mistakes be pillars to a healthier approach to how we interact with the public and how we support the devotees who go out to meet it. Is everyone all right?
Yes.
Should I just keep going? Srila Prabhupada taught us that ISKCON's success is based on the love and trust we share. ISKCON leaders must create an environment in which the body of devotees will feel enlivened to perform devotional service that is, in Srila Prabhupada's own words, individual, spontaneous, and voluntary. In the spiritually surcharged atmosphere that will result if we follow this mood, devotees will naturally feel inspired to reach for even higher goals, both in their service and in their spiritual relationships. It's so much easier to sacrifice and work hard when one's heart is filled with gratitude for what one has and what one is becoming. That is a basic theme of our family business. The good news is that by systematic training in the art of distributing Srila Prabhupada's books, as well as by reading those books with like-minded devotees, we can raise our consciousness, overcome our shortcomings, and continually improve our service. Where there's a will, there's a way. Keeping our prime directive to leave each person we meet with a good impression and emphasizing that book distributors must be exemplars of the principles contained in the books they distribute, we can both increase the distribution of Srila Prabhupada's books and act in ways that will win the hearts of the public. Therefore, I stress in this book the importance of being strict, serious, and sincere in one's daily practices of devotional service. This is a prerequisite for book distributors, and it is a prerequisite for those who have positions of authority in the Sankirtan movement, whether those persons be managers, parents, teachers, or Sankirtan leaders. Because Srila Prabhupada emphasized that failure is a pillar of success, another reason I wrote this book, and perhaps its most important reason, is to identify what we did and are still doing right so that we can concentrate on our successes and continue to perfect the ways and means by which Srila Prabhupada's books are distributed. I am often asked what we have to show for all the books we've distributed. I've answered this question in the last chapter, but here's one small example of how Srila Prabhupada's books had a dramatic effect on an entire nation. In the summer of 1989, the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust took advantage of a new law allowing religious books to enter the Soviet Union and printed 200,000 Russian language books in Germany. The Soviet customs officials were not yet informed about this new law, however, and the truck drivers were held up at the border. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations with Soviet government officials, the trucks were finally allowed to cross, but the books were confiscated and stored in a customs warehouse in Moscow. For 2 months, the Soviet devotees organized massive protests in the streets of Moscow. They chanted, "Give us our books." The protest banners they carried read, "We don't want vodka, we want our books." The books were finally released in October of 1989. In an interview, Bhaktivigyan Swami describes the results. The entire community of Russian devotees, actually the entire community of devotees from all over the Soviet Union, participated in those demonstrations. At that time, there were altogether about 100 devotees. Everything started from those books. The temples started from those books. The new devotees came from those books. The millions and millions of books that were distributed after that, everything started from those 200,000 books. Unquote. No less important are the effects that Srila Prabhupada's books have had on millions of individual lives throughout the world. Each book distributed has an effect, even if we can't immediately see it. As we carry on the distribution of Srila Prabhupada's books all over the world, we will see such miraculous victories again and again. Our family business is a humble offering to the lotus feet of my spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and his faithful servants. Several senior devotees urged me to write this book. By their mercy, I have diligently researched Srila Prabhupada's teachings to bring out the deep affection he had for book distribution and for the devotees who distribute his books. My research also points to the fact that he considered the service of distributing his books foundational to ISKCON, even as he promoted so many other vital preaching programs, including temples, schools, restaurants, farm projects, and more. Any shortcomings or mistakes you find in this book are mine. I pray for your mercy, understanding, and forgiveness. Please feel free to correct me where necessary. I live to be corrected. Humbly in your service, Vaisesiksa Das. Completed on November 15, 2015, in the month of Kartik at ISKCON Bhaktivedanta Ashram at the foot of Govardhan Hill on the occasion of the disappearance day of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Om Tat Sat. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like you to know that in the acknowledgments, I've pointed out that the devotees at ISKCON Silicon Valley have been my inspiration to write this book. Had it not been for all of you, I wouldn't have anything to write about. In fact, I've explained that previously when I became connected to ISV and just casually was asked to be connected to the book distribution. At that time, we only had a few devotees here in the community. And then a GBC report came out. I hadn't even started yet, but the GBC report came out, and there are different categories. And under book distribution, there's grades you get. And I think the grade that we got was like a D. Somebody had put D- or something. I said, and my name was right next to it. And I couldn't sleep all night. I was like, all right, this means war. I mean, I was so angry that my name was next to a D- for book distribution. They said, I'm going to come out swinging in the morning. And then our whole project here started at ISKCON Silicon Valley talking about, moving forward in small steps. And I can even remember so many milestones. One of them was one of our first big marathons, I think in 2007, when I had proposed some really big goals, and some of the devotees said, that's a little like... And I wrote a paper about thinking big. And then we all started, Hare Krishna. We smashed that goal, and then we've never looked back here at ISV. And we've always talked about this as a laboratory, where we're trying different ways to distribute books and testing ourselves so that we can come up with ideas that we can export to various places. And to some degree, that's been successful. Many of the idea concept, MSF started here. And many of the different ideas, the smart box and various things that we've been somewhat successful at it and exporting to other places. Weekend Warriors, yeah. Of course, many of these ideas have been around for a while, but we just sort of repackaged them and revived them and exported them. And so, right back at you. Okay, I will tell you what's in the contents, just to give you an overview. There's a foreword I mentioned already by His Grace Vaisesiksa Prabhu, a preface, which I just read to you, acknowledgments, and an introduction. And then the book is divided into various sections. The first section is called Chronicles. And that was the hardest part to write. It was about the history of book distribution, particularly starting with Prabhupada in India. As he is the first book distributor. In fact, in one of the sections, when I was interviewing Satyanarayan Prabhu, one of the BBT trustees and an early member of the Bhaktivedanta library party that would go around and sell books to libraries and professors, he and his partner in traveling had come across libraries in northern India and remote parts of Kashmir where they already had books. And I said, "Where'd you get those?" And his Prabhupada had already been there. Before he came to America, he was traveling extensively, distributing his own books. What to speak of the fact that he started with a one-page Back to Godhead magazine. And in dramatic fashion, while I was in Vrindavan last year, I sat in on a class in Vrindavan in Prabhupada's, what has now become the Darshan room, where in glass cases are displayed all of Srila Prabhupada's books in various languages around the world. And Gargamuni Prabhu, one of Prabhupada's first disciples, brother of Brahmananda, was giving a class. And he has various artifacts, as do many of the early devotees. They collect a lot of things that they got from Prabhupada. One of them was an original copy of Prabhupada's first Back to Godhead magazine, which was no more than a one-page sheet, like a newspaper, just one page, 2 sides printed. And he had it in plastic so it didn't get destroyed. And he held it up, and he said, "This was the first publication Prabhupada ever made." And he said, "How do you get from this?" And then he pointed to this, and he pointed to all the books. And the contrast was so extraordinary that Prabhupada had been able to go from that one page to hundreds of books. And so I started with the history of Prabhupada toiling in India to follow the order of his spiritual master, which was to, if you ever get money, print books. So that's what he did, and he stuck to it throughout his whole life. And he, of course, as we know, came to America with those books. A little known fact that I found out from Brahmananda Prabhu when I was interviewing him just before he left the planet. And that's another thing I realized while writing this book is people do die suddenly. And they are so valuable. Every devotee is so valuable. We can't even know how valuable they are. And when they're gone, they're just gone. And I was interviewing Brahmananda Prabhu for hours about various histories, getting it straight from him. And one of the things he told me about was how Prabhupada had sold 16 sets of books, and this corroborated in some of Prabhupada's letters, to the Library of Congress, LOC, in Delhi. And there's a Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you should go see this place. It goes on for blocks and blocks. It's the biggest library in the world, and all the books are kept there. And they have branches around the world where they collect books and send them back and send them out to various places. So there's a branch in Delhi. And Prabhupada was going around relentlessly selling his first canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, in 3 volumes to various places. And one of them was the Library of Congress, who bought 16 sets. And what he was selling at that time was what he called standing orders, which means they bought the first canto in 3 volumes, but they also agreed to buy all the other volumes too when they'd come out. That's what Prabhupada was selling, is that all of them will be available. The Library of Congress sent one of those sets to the New York Public Library. Therefore, Prabhupada's books arrived in America a year before he did. See, this is symbolic, not only symbolic, but practical, the effect of book distribution, that the author and his essential ideas are carried to various places around the universe. And the very strategic place Prabhupada decided to come to was New York City, and his books had already arrived. Very indicative of the power of the written word. And now, this was Brahmananda's embellishment to the situation. He said Prabhupada used to take 3 bus transfers to go uptown to that library and visit his books. And in his own words, Prabhupada said, Brahmananda said, that was his entertainment. And you can imagine, I mean, if you know the miraculous journey that Prabhupada made, and bringing his books, and the fact that the books had already arrived and were established in the most important library in New York already, it was a harbinger of what would come. So, first is Chronicles, and I talk about in the first chapter called The Ambassador of Goodwill, how my prayers were answered and how I was sitting in suburban Lafayette, which is just across the bay. With my parents raised me there in the same house, and I had come to the point of praying and dedicating all my attention towards finding out the absolute truth. And I was one day in my room meditating on a candle flame and a small statue of Buddha that I got for Christmas. And my friend Richie Corsa came. I'll just read the first part of it. A 16-year-old junior in high school, I sat cross-legged, transfixed in meditation before a candle flame and a small golden statue of the Buddha. Locked in my room that fine spring day in suburban Lafayette, California, I had been fasting and praying to God to reveal my true path in life. I was also staunchly observing a vow of silence that day when my high school friend Richie Corsa knocked on my bedroom door. Even though he sounded annoyed, I didn't answer. I reasoned that because he and I were ultimately one, a concept I had gleaned from the books I had been reading, he would know why I wasn't responding to his loud knocking and repeated requests to let me in. Finally, he gave up and through the keyhole yelled, "Willie, I know you're in there. I'm leaving you a magazine I bought from a Hare Krishna on Telegraph Avenue. He took my last 50 cents. I have no interest in this stuff, but I know you're into it, so here it is." I'd waited until he'd gone before coming out of my room to see what kind of magazine he'd left me. It was propped against the wall next to my door. The shiny cover illustration of Lord Chaitanya immediately caught my eye. Arms raised in the air, he danced through a tropical landscape, followed by a group of other dancers. The masthead read, "Back to Godhead. Godhead is light, nescience is darkness. Where there is Godhead, there is no nescience." Richie was spot on. I was interested in this stuff. I carried it into my room to have a closer look. As soon as I turned to the inside front cover, my eyes locked onto a painting of a golden brown complexioned guru. His head was cleanly shaven and he sat cross-legged on an ornate seat. He wore flowing saffron robes and piles of lush flower garlands encircled his neck, cascading in layers down to his knees. Below the painting, the caption read, "His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada." I had been searching for a guide and had studied the countenance of many a spiritual teacher, sometimes putting their pictures in front of me when I meditated in hope that I might commune with them. Until that moment, however, I had never felt a strong connection to any of them. Now suddenly I felt exhilarated. A single thought entered my mind. This is my teacher. How and why I felt this so completely was not clear to me. Never before had I been gripped with such absolute conviction. I stared at the portrait for several minutes, and it occurred to me that it was utterly mystical for this magazine to have appeared at my door. Entranced, I turned the pages. It was obvious that someone had heard my prayers, for on each page of the magazine were answers to my deepest inquiries. Why do I have to die? Is God a person? What is the best way to know God? One article, Liberation of the Cave Dwellers by Hayagriva Das, was based on a famous analogy in Plato's Republic. The article pointed out that people living in material consciousness are ignorant of the spiritual world. The author compared them to cave dwellers who have never stepped out of their cave and seen the sun. How could they understand the world of light, he asked. Someone would have to come from outside the cave, explain the power and magnificence of the sun, and somehow demonstrate what it was like. To do so, the teacher might have to let in a beam of light and project it on the wall of the cave. The cave dweller's education would have to begin slowly because they might not even believe in something so fantastical as the sun. My room is the cave, I thought, and this magazine is the light. Someone's come to rescue me and show me the way out, back to the source of the light. Scouring each page, I studied the photographs of devotees who were working for God, cooking, printing books, talking to groups of people. Their neck beads, shaved heads, and tilak fascinated me. They looked so happy and determined. They became my heroes. This was 1973, when millions of young Americans were clamoring for peace in the face of the controversial Vietnam War. The Beatles' lyrics called us to explore the inner world of our minds, and our status quo among our peers was maintained by rejecting the status quo of society at large. At school, some of my friends talked about doing something noble with their lives, like joining the Peace Corps or working to preserve the environment. Others followed their parents' advice and worked hard to get good grades so they could get into a prestigious university. Like me, still others were confused about their place in the world. In such a turbulent and uncertain environment as the United States in the early 1970s, I often questioned the value of my dry high school studies. When a buddy of mine disappeared while hiking in the mountains, never to be found again, I felt even more desperate to discover the purpose of life. The devotees didn't look confused at all. Reading their faces, I felt they were going somewhere important and wonderful, and they seemed to know it. One article in the magazine was entitled, "We're going to the land of Krishna, the land beyond birth and death." I desperately wanted to go with them. I gave no thought at the time to the enormous effort that had gone into getting that Back to Guided magazine to my door. It had appeared magically, and I had grabbed onto it like a lifeline, not fully considering who had made the line or who had thrown it. It wouldn't take long, however, for me to meet the devotees and find out who was behind it all. My mother dropped me off for my first visit to the San Francisco Temple at 455 Valencia Street, where I met Janakinath Das, an outwardly dour but sweet-hearted devotee who sat quietly chanting on his japa beads as he leaned casually on the front steps of the temple. Unsure of the etiquette, I greeted him with a Hare Krishna and asked him if I could meet the Guru, Srila Prabhupada. Naively, I had assumed he'd be there, but Janakinath Das summarily informed me that ISKCON was an international society and that Srila Prabhupada had to travel all over the world to maintain it and was presently in India. When he saw my disappointment, however, he quickly added that Srila Prabhupada's association could be perfectly had by reading his books. Janakinath's answer satisfied me because to some degree I had already perceived this for myself. I happily followed him into the fragrant atmosphere of the San Francisco Temple, which was soon to become my home. I found out that my homecoming experience was not unique. Sharing stories with the devotees who had joined the temple before me, I found that they all had stories about receiving Srila Prabhupada's books. Apparently, we all had heard the same clarion call. One devotee, who would soon become my fast friend and mentor, Keshava Bharti Das, now Keshava Bharti Das Goswami, had been searching for God through study and meditation when his landlady brought a Sri Upanishad and Back to Godhead magazine to his door, leaving them with him because, quote, she had no interest but thought he might, unquote. A few days later, his wife Lynn, the late Kolini Devidasi, returned from vacation with a copy of Bhagavad Gita as it is she had found in a used bookstore in central Mexico. Neither his landlord nor his wife knew the contents of the books, nor had they any idea that they had gifted him with books by the same author. Keshav Bharti Das, then Kenneth Beck, also had no idea. He had put both books in a bag, unaware of the coincidence, and taken them the next evening to a gas station where he was working the midnight shift to make ends meet. On his break, just before sunrise, he took out both books to examine them. Incredulous, he at once noticed that they were from the same author. His eyes filled with tears, and he was soon weeping, certain that God had answered his prayers and intervened to show him the way to reach him. A few days later, he jumped into his Volkswagen van with his childhood friend Clint and hurried off to find the San Francisco Temple. Inconceivably, Srila Prabhupada had just arrived, and that very evening, Ken found himself sitting in front of His Divine Grace at an evening program. His material life was finished. Ask any assembly of devotees how they came to Krishna consciousness, and you will hear a montage of similarly miraculous sagas, each one precipitated by contact with Srila Prabhupada's books. The reason for such miracles is that God appears in the form of literature. The Vedic scriptures confirm this truth. The Brahma Sutra 113 says that God reveals Himself through scripture, Shastra Yonidvat. And Srimad Bhagavatam 1340 declares itself a direct incarnation of Krishna. Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahma Samhitam. This scripture named Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of God. Just as Krishna makes His divine appearance in forms made of marble, wood, and paint, He similarly descends as an incarnation in the form of paper and ink. The author, Vedavyas, is described as an empowered incarnation of Krishna because he wrote down the eternal Vedic knowledge. The enormous effort Srila Prabhupada and his followers made to get that Back to Godhead magazine, BTG, to my door was gradually disclosed to me. It was through an intense labor of pure devotion, empowered by the order of his spiritual master, that Srila Prabhupada caused these beautiful incarnations of the Lord to appear in the various languages of the world. Then, as a master conductor directs an orchestra, Srila Prabhupada inspired his young followers to illustrate, edit, publish, and distribute more than 50 million copies of the 80 books he had written in little more than a decade. You take that in, 50 million copies, starting from nothing. He needed editors, and editors appeared. He needed Sanskritists, and they emerged. He encouraged fledgling artists, and they flourished. Young people, unfamiliar with publishing, shipping, warehousing, or sales, found themselves managing millions of dollars worth of books and seeing to their distribution. All of this arranged by His divine grace after he had reached his 70th year. Srila Prabhupada had begun to write in earnest as early as 1944, publishing and distributing his single-sheet Back to Godhead leaflets. After finally retiring from his business and family life in 1954, moving to the Vamshi Gopalaji temple at Vrindavan's Keshi Ghat in 1956, and accepting the renounced order of life in 1959, he conceived of his multi-volume presentation of Srimad Bhagavatam. He traveled to and from Delhi, beginning the work on his magnum opus in the Chippiwada district of Delhi, where he had been given a room at a Radha Krishna temple by an acquaintance, Krishna Pandit. In 1960, he moved into his tiny quarters at the famous Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan, where he would reside for nearly a decade, publishing and distributing Back to Godhead, and preparing his Srimad Bhagavatam purports and a series of other writings. There, he incubated his plan to carry out the request of his spiritual master had made of him, that he write and preach in English and take Krishna consciousness to the West. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's request was not new, for book printing and distribution has always been the family business of the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur wrote over 100 books, and before him the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan, on the order of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, had published hundreds of books. In fact, most great Vaishnava spiritual masters have made literary contributions. Mahaprabhu himself had rediscovered and then with his own hand distributed copies of Sri Brahma Samhita and Sri Krishna Karnamrita to his closest disciples. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur, to highlight the prominence of literature in his Gaudiya Mat mission, included an image of the printing press on its logo, and often preached that distributing books was better than building opulent temples. Passing on the tradition of the previous great teachers of pure devotional service, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur personally told our Srila Prabhupada that if he ever got money, he should print books. Srila Prabhupada begins publishing. In Jhansi, before Srila Prabhupada had gone to Vrindavan, he had founded the League of Devotees, an organization meant to re-spiritualize human society, and at the request of a godbrother, he had worked on the magazine Sajjana Toshini. Neither of these projects worked out the way Srila Prabhupada had wanted, but both reveal his ambitious vision. When he was handed the Sajjana Toshini project, for example, it was a simple publication with a small circulation. He soon developed a plan to expand it into a world-class publication, as popular and polished as India's Illustrated Weekly. But the godbrother who had asked for his help, overwhelmed by Srila Prabhupada's enterprising approach, released him from the project. Land disputes and a lack of local interest had foiled Srila Prabhupada's League of Devotees in Jhansi, but his plans for the project there had not been small either. He had intended to recruit and train members to teach the Bhagavad Gita and to perform Nam Sankirtan throughout the world. Undeterred by the lack of response in Jhansi and the conflicts he had endured while editing Sajjana Toshini, with no fixed income or residence, and only a couple of dhotis and kurtas, Srila Prabhupada soon launched his Back to Godhead as a magazine. The printer of Srila Prabhupada's first BTG, Kumar Jain in New Delhi, remembers that Srila Prabhupada was so poor that he usually arrived at his shop without having had breakfast. Srila Prabhupada saved money for printing his magazine by skipping meals and walking instead of riding, hiring a rickshaw only when it was absolutely necessary in order to carry heavy rolls of paper for printing. Alone in New Delhi, he wrote, edited, published, and distributed BTG. In the scorching heat, he personally visited government offices, shopping areas, and tea stalls to sell his magazine. Sometimes he mailed out free copies both within India and abroad. After living and preaching in Delhi for some time, Srila Prabhupada moved back to Vrindavan. But unlike other sadhus, who out of fear of being contaminated vow never to leave the holy Dham, Srila Prabhupada came and went, venturing to Delhi, Bombay, and Kanpur to raise funds for publishing his BTG. As with Sajjana Toshini, Srila Prabhupada's dream for BTG was grand. He eventually wanted printings of BTG sent to 50 countries around the world. In the midst of printing and distributing the small magazine, several people suggested that he also produce and distribute books because they were more permanent. He took this advice as coming from Krishna and wrote his first booklet, Easy Journey to Other Planets. Soon after, he began work on his Srimad Bhagavatam translations and purports. Everyone okay? Commuting from Vrindavan to Delhi to promote his cause, Srila Prabhupada stayed in the homes of pious Hindu hosts. Sri Krishna Pandit gave him a room in Chippiwada near Chandi Chowk and also volunteered to do some secretarial work for him. From those Chippiwada days, Sri Krishna Pandit remembers that Srila Prabhupada was engaged in translating and writing his commentaries on Srimad Bhagavatam. He cooked for himself and typed and checked the proofs for BTG. Every day, he was typing. His main activity was typing many hours a day, Sri Krishna Pandit recalls. Srila Prabhupada had practically no financial means while living in Vrindavan at the Radha Damodar Mandir. Still, he had every intention of spreading the message of Srimad Bhagavatam all over the world. His intense desire to do so became especially clear when he received an invitation to join the Congress for Cultivating the Human Spirit in Japan. In preparation for the event, he suspended his other projects and worked exclusively on a book called Light of the Bhagavat, a manuscript tailor-made for the Japanese event. Simultaneously, he wrote a volley of letters appealing to potential patrons, including India's Prime Minister, beseeching them to pay his fare to Japan so that he might attend the Congress and bring knowledge of the Bhagavat to Japan and the rest of the world. In the end, he was forced to cancel his trip, for no one gave him the money he needed. But he now had the manuscript for Light of the Bhagavat completed. By the way, that ended up in a trunk, and it was posthumously produced. Tamal Krishna Maharaj put it together and had a Chinese artist do the paintings for it and things like that. But it never got published during his time with us. Characteristically undeterred, Srila Prabhupada continued to pray to the Lord, when will the day come when a temple will be established in every house in every corner of the world? Prahlad Maharaj, in his prayers to Lord Nrsingadev, expresses his desire to live near big cities and towns, unlike most transcendentalists who prefer solitude, to deliver the fallen souls who are working hard, making elaborate plans for material happiness by maintaining their families, societies, and countries. Similarly, although Srila Prabhupada referred to Vrindavan as his home, it was also the base from which, out of compassion for the fallen souls of the world, he planned his campaign to distribute Srimad Bhagavatam and the holy names of Krishna to every continent on the globe. He created a pamphlet to promote sales of his first publication of Srimad Bhagavatam. The headline of that pamphlet said, Srimad Bhagavatam, India's message of peace and goodwill. Soon Srila Prabhupada would become the world's greatest ambassador of this message. A careful study of this pamphlet reveals much about His Divine Grace's indomitable spirit. He had produced only 3 volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam, but the pamphlet advertised 60 volumes of elaborate English version. Although he would arrive in America with no support, no connections, and no money, his pamphlet includes the words all over the world for scientific knowledge of God. A representative from the spiritual world. The dictionary meaning of ambassador is an accredited diplomat sent by a country of its official representative to a foreign country. The word ambassador derives from the Latin ambacus, servant. As the servant of his spiritual master, Srila Prabhupada knew that he was connected to the current of transcendental sound flowing from the spiritual world. He explained this principle to his disciple, Jamunacharya Das, in a letter dated October 21st, 1969. Quote, when the Lord appeared on this earth 5,000 years ago, he instructed Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, and this purely transcendental message of Krishna has been passed down for the last 5,000 years by the media of sincere disciples giving submissive oral reception to the words of Krishna via the medium of the bona fide spiritual master. This acts like electricity, and if you touch a wire anywhere which is connected to the powerhouse, then you will be in contact with the electric current. As an ambassador, Srila Prabhupada knew the unlimited power of his actual home country, Goloka Vrindavan, and its leader, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He was connected and he knew it. Therefore, in his prayer to Krishna, penned aboard the freighter Jaladuta, Srila Prabhupada wrote, Tabi jadi tava kripa ahaituki, sakalai sambhava hoy tumi se kautuki. But I know your causeless mercy can make everything possible because you are the most expert mystic. This same mood appears repeatedly throughout his teachings. In his purport to Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.36, for example, Srila Prabhupada writes, there is no need to seek properly qualified candidates for discharging devotional service to the Lord. Let them be either well-behaved or ill-trained. Let them be either learned or fools. Let them be either grossly attached or in the renounced order of life. Let them be liberated souls or desirous of salvation. Let them be inexpert in the discharge of devotional service or expert in the same. All of them can be elevated to the supreme position by discharging devotional service under the proper guidance. The Bhagavatam also states that its very purpose is to create a revolution in the impious lives of this world's misdirected civilization. As the person Bhagavat, His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, repeatedly and urgently called for a worldwide massive campaign to re-spiritualize humanity by distributing transcendental sound. This was his plan all along. Decades before coming to America, he had drawn up a blueprint for a society that would train pure devotees who would go out to save others. In India, many persons warned him of the perils of leaving his motherland to cross the ocean. Some even argued that not only were Westerners incapable of being purified, but they would also profane the Hindu religion. Srila Prabhupada knew well the power of Srimad Bhagavatam, the literary incarnation of Lord Krishna, the most merciful Lord who had given liberation to the demon Putana, who had, even after she had tried to poison him. There's just 2 paragraphs left. Should I finish? Yes. Oh, all right. Unlike most people who cross the ocean to find fame, money, or a better way of life, Srila Prabhupada traveled as an ambassador of goodwill to distribute the fruits of love for God to the spiritually impoverished masses, just as the most merciful form of Krishna, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, had done and ordered everyone else to do 500 years before. Ataiva shab phal deha jari tari, kaya hauk loka ajar amare. Distribute this Krishna consciousness movement all over the world. Let people eat these fruits and ultimately become free from old age and death. Ataiva ami agna dilun shabakare, jahan tahan prema phal deha jari tari. Therefore, I order every man within this universe to accept this Krishna consciousness movement and distribute it everywhere. Those who give others the opportunity to go back to Godhead are by far the most charitable. About these magnanimous souls, Narottam Das Thakur sings, Ebe Jash Gushik Tribhuvan. They are famous all over the 3 worlds. The effect of Lord Chaitanya's unlimited goodwill delivered through the grand vision of his pure devotee Srila Prabhupada to distribute transcendental literature throughout the world touched me that day in unlikely suburban Lafayette, California. Is it any wonder that Srila Prabhupada's sacrifice and determined campaign to bring the fruits of love of Godhead to the people of the world have made him the most famous? No one can compare. Therefore, he is the greatest ambassador of goodwill the world has ever seen. Hare Krishna. Okay, so just a brief summary, and I'll stop here. The first section is Chronicles. I just read you the first chapter. But it goes on from there. Becoming an ambassador of goodwill. The next chapter is called Apply the Order. And then it goes into the very specific history when Prabhupada reached America. The next chapter is called Press On, because it's about how he started the ISKCON Press. The first building that was purchased in America was in Boston, and Prabhupada had said that he wanted a building. We didn't own any property in ISKCON, but he wanted the first property so he could establish a printing press. That was why he wanted the building. And they had to go and reinforce the floor so that it could hold the press in this old building that they got. And that's where they started ISKCON Press. And then the next chapter is called The Rest is History. And it talks about the explosion of book distribution, which really started around 1973. There were various ways in which devotees were distributing a few books here and there, and BTG started to gain prominence, especially when Spiritual Sky incense was introduced. So they would sell packs of incense and then a BTG, and increased in that way. But then there was a discovery of how to distribute big books. A few devotees, and I talk about the few incidents that the devotees stumbled upon how to distribute a big book, because it was considered impossible. And then something just broke loose. And suddenly thousands, and then tens of thousands, and then millions of books, big books, were being distributed all over the world. And the step-by-step history I've described here. And then the next chapter is called The United Nations of Book Distribution, because book distribution started in America and then it spread all over the world to other places. Practically simultaneously, India started with life membership. Harinam was going on in India, and people were coming along and throwing coins, and Prabhupada had stopped the Harinam because he thought people weren't taking it seriously. They took it as some professional thing or something that was not actually spiritual. So he started this life membership. I interviewed Giriraj Maharaj a lot for that. He was one of the first to take that up. And he said that Prabhupada's intention for life membership was to distribute his books. So that went on, and then there's all over the world, I've tried to touch on all the various continents where book distribution awoke and took off in miraculous ways. Then, what's that? Signing, okay. Then tenets, which include the various ways in which book distribution is our family business. Literary kirtan and the Yuga Dharma. Sometimes this question comes up about, well, isn't chanting Hare Krishna our Yuga Dharma, book distribution something else? And I talk about how they're one and the same, and they should go on simultaneously. And then the last, then there's axioms. A lot of the things that we've been teaching in seminars for a long time about the 4 laws of book distribution, and mood and method, how to sell sets of books, how to do door-to-door, how to organize, the monthly Sankirtan festival. And the last section is called realizations. And it is about various realizations. Om Tat Sat. So, now what? Now, the books are available, so if you want to take the books, then please do. And I think we've got a shipment here. So there's a few available, and you can have them. And if you'd like, I'll sign them for you, because I'm sitting right here. And